The echo came back in 9/10 of a second. I need to be specific about that because the number is the entire point. Claire was holding her phone with the stopwatch function running, standing at the eastern margin of a body of water that is not on any map, and she triggered the stopwatch on the tone from the speaker and stopped it on the echo. She ran the test 3 times. 0.87 seconds, 0.91, 0.93. The laser rangefinder in my left hand read 127 feet to the north wall of the cirque. At the speed of sound in air at 58 degrees Fahrenheit, an echo off a surface 127 feet away returns in approximately 0.2 of a second, essentially instantaneous. What we recorded was 4.5 times too long. The sound we sent across that water hit something roughly 500 feet away, in a space 130 feet wide, and came back. My uncle described the same phenomenon in a patrol log dated September 3, 1977. He shouted across the water and counted the delay. He estimated 1.2 seconds. He calculated the implied reflecting surface at 650 feet. He was standing in the same cirque beside the same water 47 years before my daughter and I knelt at its margin with a speaker and a phone. His data and ours do not match in magnitude. The space was smaller in 1977. I need to go back to the beginning, but not to the beginning of the story. The story probably begins in 1971, and I did not learn that until the end. I need to go back to a Tuesday in March 2022, when I carried a banker's box up from the basement of the Park County Historical Society in Cody, Wyoming, and found 9 cloth-bound patrol log books filled with my dead uncle's handwriting. My uncle was Dale Irvin Cowell, born 1943 in Powell, Wyoming. Died 2004 in the same town, in the house he grew up in, from pancreatic cancer that moved through him in about 11 weeks. He was 61. I was 31 when he died, and I'd known him my entire life as a quiet, principled, somewhat remote man who had worked for the Forest Service from 1968 to 1986 and then spent his remaining years running a welding shop behind his house. He welded irrigation pipe, stock gates, trailer hitches. He had hands that could hold a bead on thin-wall tubing without burning through, which is a skill that does not translate to conversation. And Dale was not a man who translated much of anything into conversation. At holidays, he sat with the family and ate and spoke when addressed, and laughed occasionally at things that were genuinely funny and drove home early. When I was 8, I asked him what he did for the Forest Service, and he said, "Walk and write it down." I did not know he had been a backcountry patrol ranger in some of the roughest drainage country in the Absaroka Range. I did not know his assigned territory included the Upper Painter Creek drainage, the Sulphur Creek Loop, and a section of the Sunlight Corridor above the bridge. I learned these things from his own handwriting in government-issued field log books that had spent 31 years in a cardboard box in a basement 60 miles from where he died. I teach earth science. Taught, I should say. 31 years of 8th graders in Cody, retired in 2019 with a pension and a house that was paid off, and more free hours than I knew how to fill. I started volunteering at the Park County Historical Society because I had always been interested in the settlement history of the basin, and because the alternative was watching my joints stiffen in a recliner. The society operates from a small brick building on Sheridan Avenue that most people walk past without a second look. The collection is modest. Ranching ledgers, irrigation district minutes, photograph albums donated when the last person who recognized the faces died. And in the basement, 14 banker's boxes labeled USFS Shoshone National Forest, miscellaneous district records transferred 1991. They were not hidden or restricted. When the Forest Supervisor's Office in Cody moved locations in 1991, someone in records management followed the standard disposition protocol for non-permanent administrative files, and because the Historical Society would accept them and a dumpster would not preserve them, They ended up on a metal shelf under a fluorescent tube that buzzed at a frequency I could feel in my back teeth. The archivist who accepted them, a woman named Gail Probst, who has since died, signed a single intake form. That form is still stapled to the first box. I do not think anyone opened any of those boxes between 1991 and the afternoon I carried number 4 upstairs to the reading table because I was looking for early grazing allotment records for a presentation on Sunlight Basin ranching families. The first 3 boxes contained exactly what the labels promised: administrative correspondence, timber sale evaluations, range readiness reports, all from the 1960s and 1970s, printed or typed on the thin government stock that yellows at the edges but does not crumble. Box 4 was heavier. When I lifted the lid, instead of loose file folders, I found 9 hardbound patrol log books held together with a rubber band that had fused to the green cloth covers and had to be cut. The books covered the period from April 1974 to October 1978. Every page was filled in a handwriting I knew the way. You know a voice on the phone from across a room, because you did not study it, you simply grew up near it. Small, forward-leaning, every letter closed at the top. Dale's. I sat at that table until the society closed at 5. I did not finish. I came back the next morning and read until closing and the morning after that, and for 2 more days after that. On the 5th day, I brought a legal pad and started the notes that eventually filled 3 of them. The Society does not allow photographs of unpublished material without a formal request, and I was not ready to file one because I was not ready to explain to anyone why I wanted photographs of my dead uncle's government patrol logs. I am going to describe what those logs contain. I will move through the early material quickly because the early material is not the problem. The early entries are the baseline. They are what normal looks like, and you need normal to understand what happened to normal. From spring 1974 through approximately June 1976, Dale's logs are a model of professional field documentation. Daily entries, dated, noting trail conditions with mechanical precision. Blowdown counts by diameter. Tread erosion at specific switchbacks. Cairn maintenance, creek crossing depths, snowmelt progress. He records weather as operational data. 1430, cumulus building WSW, estimated base 11,000. Wind shift NE by 1500. Descended to timber by 1530. He documents stock encounters, grazing permit compliance, fire ring conditions at named campsites Reef Camp, Mule Creek Flat, the bench below Skull Ridge. He notes cutthroat spawning in the lower pool at Painter Creek Ford, approximately 3 weeks ahead of 1975 timing. He was a precise man doing precise work, and the evidence is in the quality of the record. Reading those early entries is like listening to a machine that measures terrain and converts it into sentences. The change is gradual. I did not catch it on my first read-through. I caught it on the second, when my notes let me see the pattern from above. Starting in late June 1976, Dale begins spending more time in the upper Painter Creek drainage than his patrol route required. His assigned loop covered roughly 28 miles across 3 drainages, on an 8 to 10 day rotation, with resupply at a vehicle cache near the Sunlight trailhead. In the early logs, his entries distribute evenly across the route. After June 1976, they do not. He is going above the fork, where the maintained trail ends, and the terrain becomes a steep-walled volcanic canyon choked with deadfall and talus. He notes this matter-of-factly on July 15, 1976. Above Painter Fork, no maintained tread. Game Trail follows the north bank approximately 1.5 miles to a bench. Above the bench, the drainage narrows to a slot, and travel is in the creek. Unremarkable. Rangers routinely explore terrain adjacent to their assigned routes. What is remarkable is that he goes back. I need to leave the logs here for a moment, and because what I did next is part of how the pieces assembled into something I could no longer organize on a legal pad. In April 2022, about 3 weeks after I finished my first full reading, I drove to Powell to visit my mother. She was 81, still in her own house, still sharp in the ways that mattered, and selective in the ways she had always been. I told her I had been reading Dale's old Forest Service patrol logs at the Historical Society. I told her they covered his backcountry work in the Absarokas through the mid-70s, and I asked her if Dale had ever mentioned Painter Creek. There was a silence I can only describe as structural, not empty, organized. She was selecting from available responses, and I recognized the process because I had watched her do it my entire life. It is a Cowell trait, this internal editing before speech. Then she said, "He mentioned it." I asked what he had said. He said there was something at the top of it that bothered him. I asked if she knew what it was. He never said. I assumed it was a body, a lost hiker maybe. You know how he was. I did know how he was. After Vietnam in 1966, he sat on his mother's porch for 2 weeks, and then enrolled in a forestry program at the community college without discussing either the porch or the enrollment with anyone. That was Dale. You waited for him to offer, and he did not offer. My mother said one more thing before I left. She said, "He went back to it a lot. That's what bothered your grandmother, not the thing itself." How often he went. She was looking at the window when she said it, not at me, and she did not elaborate. I drove back to Cody, thinking about the word grandmother. My grandmother died in 1989. She had known. My mother had known. Not what was up there, they never knew that. Just the pattern. That Dale kept going back to a place that had nothing to do with his assignment, and that the going back was the thing the family watched from the outside, the way you watch someone develop a habit you cannot name as either harmful or harmless. When I returned to the logs, I started tracking his visits on a calendar. The data confirmed what the entries suggested. Between July 1976 and October 1978, Dale made 41 documented trips above the Painter Creek Fork to the head of the drainage. 41. On a roughly 14-day cycle that he himself noticed and logged on October 2nd, 1976. I realize I have been returning to the cirque on a roughly 14-day cycle. I did not plan this. My patrol schedule does not require it. The cycle is not intentional, but it is consistent. I am noting this for the record. He was tracking his own behavior, logging his own pattern. He was a man who walked and wrote it down, and at some point the walking and the writing became the only governance he had over the destination. Now, I need to describe what he found up there, because the entries about the cirque are the reason those logs were pulled from the active files, boxed and shelved where nobody would open them for 3 decades. July 22nd, 1976. First visit. Reached the head of Painter Creek drainage at approximately 10,600 feet. The drainage terminates in a shallow cirque below the ridgeline. There is a body of standing water in the cirque floor, roughly 40 yards across, that is not shown on the quad. Water is clear, no visible inlet or outlet. No wind disturbance on the surface despite moderate wind at my elevation. Spent approximately 45 minutes observing. No fish, no insects on the surface. Water temperature not measured but hand tested as very cold. I am uncertain why this feature is not mapped. That entry is professional. It is what a competent ranger writes when documenting an unmapped feature for the record. A small alpine tarn missed by aerial survey, probably photographed under snow cover and never ground-checked. The kind of thing you note, report to the district office, and let a survey crew confirm the next season. But Dale did not wait for a survey crew. 11 days later he was back. August 3rd, 1976. Returned to the cirque at the head of Painter Creek. The body of water appears unchanged. I measured the approximate dimensions by pacing the margin: 38 to 42 yards at the widest, 26 to 30 yards across the short axis. Depth cannot be determined visually. The water is clear, but the bottom is not visible. I tested with a 10-foot pole I cut from a standing dead lodgepole at the margin. The pole did not touch bottom. 16 days later. August 19th. Third visit to the cirque. I have been thinking about why this feature is absent from the topographic survey. The 1974 quad shows the drainage terminating in talus and a small seasonal snowfield. No permanent water. I am looking at permanent water. The surface is undisturbed. I dropped a pebble from approximately 4 feet above the surface. It entered the water and I watched it descend. I could see it for approximately 8 to 10 seconds, falling straight, before it passed beyond visibility. This is not a shallow feature. Now, I want to step away from the logs again because during the same week I was reading these entries for the second time, I did something that changed the shape of what I was holding. I went to the Park County Library and requested Dale's borrowing history. They keep it on microfiche going back to 1965, and the librarian, a woman named Sandra, who I had known since she was in my earth science class in 1997, pulled the records without asking why. Between March and June of 1977, Dale checked out 3 books: Henderson and Picard's Geology of the Absaroka Range, a USGS report on the Sunlight Volcano Vent Complex, and a University of Wyoming monograph on Eocene volcaniclastic depositional environments of northwestern Wyoming. I taught earth science for 31 years. I know what those books contain. The Absaroka volcanics are the remnants of a field that was active for 10 million years during the Middle Eocene, 53 to 43 million years ago. 12 volcanic centers generated edifices rising up to 10,000 feet above valley floors. The rocks are andesite flows, flow breccia, and thick aprons of volcaniclastic sediment lahars, conglomerates, reworked debris. Underneath all of it sits Precambrian basement rock, which in this part of Wyoming is more than 2.5 billion years old. Dale was teaching himself the geology of the ground under that water. He was looking for an explanation in the deep structure, and what he found or did not find is in the logs. September 7th, 1976. Fourth visit. I brought my 50-foot tape and a plumb weight. I lowered the weight from the eastern margin, which I selected because the rock drops vertically into the water with no shelf. The weight descended the full 50 feet and did not contact bottom. I repeated this from the northern margin. Same result. The water is at minimum 50 feet deep in a cirque that is no more than 40 yards wide. I do not understand the geometry of this. The bedrock is Absaroka volcanic andesite breccia, at most 200 feet thick in this formation, overlying Precambrian basement. A natural feature 50 feet deep and 40 yards across in this geology would require either glacial excavation, which the cirque form supports, or structural collapse, which the surrounding rock does not support. The absence from the quad is a surveying omission, likely because this area was mapped from aerial photographs during snow cover. But the depth does not match the setting. I am going to request the original survey data from the supervisor's office. That is the last entry that reads like a ranger writing a patrol log. After it, something in the writing shifts. Not the handwriting that stays controlled, every letter closed, every line straight. The content. Dale stops distributing his attention across the territory he is paid to cover. I know this because his other entries collapse. Entire weeks of patrol compressed into single lines. May 14th to 20th. Standard patrol. No issues. Then 2 full pages on a single visit to the cirque. The 1977 season reads like watching a lens narrow. He begins documenting things that a reasonable field professional would not normally log. Air temperature at the water's margin versus 10 feet away. The color of the surface at different times of day, using paint chip terminology I believe he borrowed from a hardware store color guide. Opal gray at dawn, viridian at midday, pewter under overcast. He maps the rock around the margin with the geological precision that exceeds his training, and this is where the library books become visible in his writing. He has given himself the vocabulary to describe the andesite breccia, the fracture patterns, the mineral staining at the waterline. He is building a catalog of a place, and the catalog is replacing everything else in his professional life. I found the institutional confirmation of this in a different box, the seventh one, which I did not open until May 2022 because I was working through them sequentially. Inside a manila folder labeled CFK District Personnel Actions, 1978 to 1980, I found a memorandum from the Clarks Fork District Ranger to the Forest Supervisor, dated November 14, 1978. It was typed on Forest Service letterhead, 2 paragraphs, signed by a man named Ted Kirchner. The first paragraph stated that Ranger Dale Cowell's field productivity on assigned patrol routes has declined significantly during the 1977 and 1978 seasons, with multiple patrol segments showing incomplete coverage and documentation well below district standards. The second paragraph recommended that Ranger Cowell's patrol logs for the 1974 to 1978 period be removed from the active filing system and placed in archival storage pending review, and that Ranger Cowell be reassigned from Backcountry Patrol to road maintenance duties effective with the 1979 season. It noted that Ranger Cowell had been informed of the reassignment and had accepted it without objection. Without objection. Dale spent 10 years patrolling the most remote drainage country in the Shoshone, and when they pulled him off it and put him on road maintenance, he accepted without objection. I have thought about that silence more than almost anything else in this story. It was the same silence he brought back from Vietnam, the same silence he kept through holidays and family gatherings for 26 years after those logs ended. It was not the silence of a man who did not care. It was the silence of a man who had decided that the thing he knew could not be carried by speech. But I have not told you about the sound yet, and the sound is the part that brought my daughter and me to that cirque 47 years after Dale first described it. In August 1977, Dale begins documenting the acoustic properties of the cirque. Dropped a fist-sized rock into the water from chest height. The splash was normal in character-appropriate volume, appropriate ring pattern, but the echo from the cirque walls arrived late. I have been in enough box canyons and cirques to know that echo return should be nearly instantaneous at this diameter. The delay was approximately 1 full second. I counted it. I counted it again on the second drop. Same delay. The cirque is not acoustically behaving like its dimensions suggest. September 3rd, 1977. Shouted across the water at full voice, aimed at the north wall. Echo return was again delayed. I estimate 1.2 seconds. At the speed of sound, this would suggest the reflecting surface is approximately 650 feet away. The north wall of the cirque is at most 120 feet from my position. I am not measuring the wall. And then in 1978, his final season, the data becomes something I had to chart on graph paper to believe. Dale begins running echo tests at multiple times of day during the same visit. 3 data points per trip. Dawn, midday, late afternoon. The pattern was consistent across 4 visits, and here are the numbers because the numbers are the thing I cannot put away. Dawn. Delay approximately 0.6 seconds. Implied reflecting surface at roughly 330 feet. Midday, delay approximately 1.0 second. Implied surface at 560 feet. Late afternoon, delay approximately 1.4 seconds. Implied surface at 770 feet. The acoustic space was expanding across the course of the day. Whatever the sound was bouncing off, it was moving away from Dale as the hours passed. By afternoon, the echo was traveling 6 times the physical width of the cirque before it returned. I am an earth science teacher. I know how sound propagates. I know what an echo measures. What Dale's data describes is a space that does not correspond to the space you can see. And that space was breathing, contracting at night, expanding by day, on a cycle as regular as the light. October 4th, 1978, is the last dated entry. It reads in full. Arrived circa 7:30. Water level unchanged. Temperature at margin 34 degrees. Air temperature 29 degrees. Light frost on surrounding rock. No frost on the water surface, no frost within approximately 2 feet of the margin in any direction, though frost was heavy beyond that radius. I knelt at the eastern margin and placed my hand flat on the surface. The water was warm, not lukewarm. Warm, as in actively heated. I held my hand there for approximately 30 seconds. During that time, the wind stopped completely, though it had been blowing from the northwest at an estimated 10 to 15 miles per hour when I arrived. The stillness lasted for the duration of my contact with the surface. When I removed my hand, the wind resumed. My hand was dry. I am reporting this exactly as it occurred. I have no explanation. I am going to close out my season log and hike out today. One more entry, undated. On the last page of the 9th book, in cursive, not Dale's usual block print, and I did not know he could write cursive 5 words. I don't think it is water. I brought everything to my daughter in Billings in June 2022. The legal pads, the calendar of Dale's visits, the notes on the Kirchner memorandum. Claire is 34, a structural engineer who designs commercial buildings. An ultra-marathon runner who completed a 100-mile race in the Bighorns in 26 hours. She is not a person who entertains unverifiable claims. She sat at her kitchen table for 20 minutes reading my notes in silence, which is the longest I have seen her sit still since she was a child. Then she said, "Have you been there?" I had not. She said, "We should go." I said I was not sure I wanted to. She looked at me the way she looks at a structural drawing that contains an error she has already identified. She said, "You are not going to stop thinking about this. You might as well go see it." She was right. We spent July and August preparing. Claire researched the access to Sunlight Trailhead, the condition of Trail 813, the distance to the fork, the terrain above it. She ordered a laser rangefinder, a digital thermometer with a probe, a 100-foot measuring tape, and a small Bluetooth speaker that could produce a calibrated tone through a signal generator app on her phone. That last item was her idea. If we were going to test Dale's acoustic data, she wanted a consistent sound source, not a human voice. She also brought a handheld anemometer because the wind behavior Dale described, stopping during contact with the surface, was something she wanted to measure rather than feel. I spent those months differently. I went back to the boxes at the Historical Society and worked through numbers 5 through 14. In box 7, besides the Kirchner memo, I found something else. A carbon copy of a requisition form Dale submitted to the district office in September 1976, requesting original survey documentation for T5 2NR106W, Section 14 and adjacent sections, Painter Creek Drainage, head of Cirque, for the purpose of confirming a possible unmapped hydrological feature. Stapled to the requisition was a handwritten note on Clark's Fork district letterhead, unsigned, that read, "Requested materials not available at district level. Forwarded to S.O. No response expected before spring 1977. Below that, in a different hand, penciled lightly, "See 1971 inventory. See 1971 inventory." I stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then I searched every remaining box for anything referencing a 1971 inventory. I found nothing. I called the forest supervisor's office in Cody. The person in records management, a young woman whose name I wrote down and have since lost, said she had no record of a 1971 resource inventory for that section. She said inventory records from the early 1970s were incomplete in the digital system, and that physical files from that era had been sent to the Federal Records Center in Denver during a consolidation in 1996. She suggested I submit a FOIA request. I filed one in August 2022. As of today, 14 months later, I have received an acknowledgement letter and nothing else. The penciled note, "See 1971 inventory," meant that someone at some point knew about the feature at the head of Painter Creek at least 3 years before Dale first walked up there. Dale's discovery, as he logged it, was his own. But it was not the first. We left for the trailhead on September 5th of last year. Claire drove us from Cody in her truck, north on 120 to the Chief Joseph Highway, then west on 296 through the Sunlight Basin. The road follows the creek through open ranching country that narrows as the Absarokas close in from both sides. By the time you reach the forest boundary, the valley is a corridor of lodgepole and Douglas fir pressed between walls of dark volcanic rock. It was a clear morning, temperature in the mid-30s, frost on the grass at the pullouts. Claire had the heater running and I held my coffee in both hands and watched the country open and close around us the way it does on every mountain highway. One moment you can see 10 miles of ridgeline. The next you are in a slot of timber where the sky is a strip overhead. The Absarokas are not welcoming mountains. They are steep, crumbly, prone to rock slide, and composed almost entirely of volcanic breccia that weathers into angles and loose faces that punish anyone who tries to leave a maintained trail. I taught this geology for 3 decades. Driving through it, with Dale's logs and a dry bag behind the seat, felt like arriving at a place I had described from photographs and was seeing for the first time in 3 dimensions. We parked at the Sunlight Trailhead at 07:30 on September 6th. 2 other vehicles in the lot, a horse trailer with Montana plates and a Subaru with a PCT sticker that suggested someone had either ambitious plans or nostalgic bumper taste. Claire signed the trail register. I noted that the last entry before ours was 4 days old, a party of 2 headed for Sulphur Creek, expected out on the 7th. The trailhead elevation is approximately 7,200 feet. The cirque, based on Dale's logs and the topo, sits at roughly 10,600. We had 3,400 feet of elevation gain over approximately 9 miles. The first 7 on maintained trail, the last 2 on game trail and creek bed. I should describe the trail because the trail is where Dale's writing comes alive. Trail 813 follows Painter Creek through a valley bottom that starts wide open meadow flanked by lodgepole and Engelmann spruce and narrows as you gain elevation. The trail is in fair condition, built to Forest Service standards that have not changed much since Dale walked it. Bench-cut sidehill sections, log water bars on the steeper pitches, rock cribbing at the creek crossings. Within the first mile I passed 2 blowdowns that had been recently cleared, fresh saw cuts on lodgepole, 12 and 16 inches, the sawdust still yellow. An outfitter's crew, probably, keeping the trail open for fall hunting clients. Dale would have noted the same thing. 2 blowdowns above the second switchback, 14-inch and 18-inch diameter. Cleared both, crosscut, debris moved off tread. His words overlaid the trail like a second surface. I walked on what he had walked on and I saw it through his log before I saw it through my own eyes. By mile 3, the valley narrowed and the lodgepole gave way to subalpine fir. The creek sound deepened as the gradient increased, more drop per foot. Water moving faster over larger cobbles. I could smell the minerals in the spray where the creek bounced off exposed andesite, a sharp, cold, iron-tinged smell that is specific to volcanic drainages and different from the granite country further south in the Wind Rivers. Claire was ahead of me on the trail, her pace steady and mechanical the way it always is on an approach. She carries a pack the way she carries a problem, distributed evenly, with no wasted motion. My knee began reporting at mile 4, a low burn on the outside of the right kneecap that I have managed since the reconstruction, and that announces itself reliably on any grade above 15%. I shortened my stride and let Claire open a gap. At mile 5, we stopped at a creek crossing to filter water. The creek here was 18 inches deep and running clear over a bed of rounded volcanic cobbles, gray-brown andesite, some with the porphyritic texture of the Wapiti Formation, others the darker, homogeneous character of the Trout Peak trichyandesite that caps the higher peaks. I could have done a lecture on those rocks. I had done a lecture on those rocks probably 300 times, standing in front of a projector showing the same USGS cross-section I first learned from in graduate school. Now, I was kneeling in the drainage where those formations cropped out, watching my daughter pump water through a filter, and somewhere above us a body of water sat in an andesite cirque and did not appear on any map. We made camp at the Painter Creek Fork at approximately 8,400 feet, arriving at 4 in the afternoon. The fork is where the maintained trail ends. Dale's game trail up the north bank was visible from our campsite, a faint track disappearing into dense subalpine fir above the junction. We set the tent on a flat bench 10 feet above the creek where the ground was carpeted with dry fir needles and the soil was firm. Someone had camped here before there was a rock fire ring, partially disassembled in the way that suggests leave no trace conscience interrupted by practicality, and a flat-topped boulder that had been used as a food prep surface so many times the lichen was worn off its center. I wondered if Dale had camped here. His logs mention the fork as a waypoint, but not as a campsite. He typically covered the full distance from the trailhead to the cirque in a single long day. He was 33 in 1976 and carried a pack the way seasonal backcountry rangers carry packs, which is to say, without apparent consciousness of it. Claire heated water on her jet boil, and we ate freeze-dried meals sitting on a downed spruce that had been serving as a bench long enough for the bark to wear smooth on top. The creek 10 feet below us ran low and clear, maybe 8 inches at the crossing, the sound of it a constant mid-range hiss that the brain learns to subtract within minutes. Steller's jays worked the fir canopy on the north slope, noisy and competitive and completely ordinary. The light drained from the valley floor while the ridgeline above us held the last of it, a deep orange band along the volcanic rim that thinned to copper and then to gray, and then was gone. The sky above the ridge held blue for another 15 minutes, a blue so clean that it looked like something behind the atmosphere rather than part of it. I sat on that log and thought about Dale sitting here, or somewhere near here, eating whatever he carried, not knowing yet what he would find at the head of the drainage, not knowing that what he found would narrow his professional life to a single unmapped feature and cost him the assignment he had held for a decade. Claire pulled out the photocopy of Dale's final entry, the dated one, October 4th, 1978, and the undated one, the cursive. I had eventually been permitted to photograph the logs after filing a formal request with the Society's board, and the copy was sharp enough to show the slight change in pen pressure on the undated page. She read both by headlamp, refolded the paper, put it in her jacket pocket, and said, "I want to leave early." That was all. She zipped into her bag and was asleep in under 10 minutes. I have never had that ability. I lay in the tent, listening to the creek and watching the tent fabric lighten and darken as clouds moved across whatever stars were up there. At approximately 3 in the morning, I woke to a silence that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Not the absence of the creek, which continued underneath, but the absence of wind. The air went perfectly still in a way that felt pressurized, as though the drainage itself had held its breath. Then a gust came through the fir tops and the night became ordinary again. I noted the time on my watch. I did not wake Claire. We broke camp at 05:30 and started up the game trail with headlamps. The trail was exactly as Dale described, faint, maintained by elk traffic, following the north bank through dense fir that thinned as we gained elevation. Within a mile, the creek entered a V-shaped slot of dark andesite. The water channeled between walls that rose 60 feet on either side, slick with spray and streaked with yellow and orange mineral deposits. The sound in the slot was amplified and oddly directional loud when you faced upstream, muffled when you turned away, as though the rock was shaping the acoustic field. I noted this, but did not think about Dale's echo data. Not yet. Above the slot, the terrain opened onto a bench, a broad, nearly flat shelf of volcanic rubble and thin alpine grass, maybe 200 yards across, with the drainage cutting through its center in a shallow channel. The timber was gone. A few Krumholtz spruce hugged the boulders at the southern edge, twisted by wind into shapes that looked rehearsed. Beyond the bench, the drainage narrowed again and steepened into a final headwall below the cirque rim. We were above tree line. The wind was steady from the northwest, cold enough that I pulled on a second layer. Claire's anemometer read 12 miles per hour. The sky was cloudless. It was approximately 8 in the morning, and the sun was still behind the eastern wall of the cirque above us. At 10,400 feet, the drainage opened into the cirque. I recognized it from Dale's descriptions the way you recognize a room you have dreamed about, not the details, but the proportions. The walls curved in a rough horseshoe of gray-brown volcanic rock, fractured into columns and slabs, with snow patches clinging to the north-facing surfaces. A low saddle at the head gave onto the ridgeline. The floor was rocky, sparse grass, a few boulders. And at the center, sitting in a shallow depression maybe 2 feet below the surrounding floor, was the water. Claire stopped walking 30 yards from the margin. I did not realize she had stopped until I was 10 yards ahead and turned. She was standing with her trekking poles planted, weight centered, the way she stands when she is processing something her instruments have not yet confirmed. She said, "It's warmer here." She was right. I had been walking and had not registered the transition, but standing still, the air was distinctly warmer than it should have been. I checked the thermometer. 58 degrees. We had measured 45 at tree line 20 minutes below. A 13-degree increase with 600 feet of elevation gain against the adiabatic lapse rate in a cirque that was fully in shadow. Claire checked the anemometer. The wind at our position read 3 miles per hour. Below the cirque rim, where we had measured 12, the same northwest flow should have accelerated as it compressed through the saddle. Instead, it was dying. We approached the margin together. The water was clear. Still. No inlet that I could see, no outlet. No insect activity on the surface, though midges were in the air around us, audible in the way that midges at altitude are audible, a thin, intermittent whine that you stop hearing when the wind gusts and pick up again in the lulls. The water's surface did not move. I need to be precise about this because it is the detail that broke Claire's composure for the first time. There was wind. I could feel it on my exposed skin. Claire's hair was shifting. The grass on the cirque floor bent and recovered, and the surface of the water was a flat plain. Not calm the way a sheltered pond is calm. Flat the way a floor is flat. As though the air touching the water and the air touching us were not continuous. Claire set down her pack and pulled out the thermometer probe. She measured water temperature at the margin. 61 degrees. 1 foot from the margin. 57. 5 feet, 52. 10 feet, 47. The warmth was radiating outward from the water, or from whatever was below it, in a gradient she plotted in her notebook with the quick, small handwriting of someone accustomed to field data. She did not speak during this process. She measured and recorded and moved to the next point. I knelt at the eastern margin, the same edge Dale described, a clean, vertical rock face dropping into the water with no shelf, no transition. The rock was andesite breccia, rough-textured, embedded with angular clasts ranging from pea-sized to fist-sized, exactly the lithology I had taught from textbook photographs. Below the waterline, the rock continued downward and disappeared into clarity. The water was clear enough to see the rock face descending for what I estimated was 15 to 20 feet before the visibility faded not into murk or sediment, but into a blue-gray depth that simply exceeded what light could penetrate. We lowered the weighted measuring tape from the eastern margin. Claire held the reel. I watched the tape descend. At 50 feet, Dale's measurement limit in 1976, no bottom. The tape continued. At 75 feet, the weight was still falling, the tape angling slightly south, which should not have happened if the feature was a simple vertical shaft. At 100 feet, the full extent of our tape, no contact. Claire reeled it back. The tape was wet to the 100-foot mark and dry above. I touched the wet section. Warm. Claire touched it. She looked at me with an expression I have seen her use at work when a load calculation returns a number outside the design envelope. Not fear. Recalibration. We spent the next 3 hours measuring. I am going to list what we found because the list is what I carry, and the list is what wakes me at 4 in the morning when the house is quiet and there is nothing between me and the data. The laser rangefinder confirmed the circ dimensions. 110 to 140 feet from the water's center to the surrounding rock walls, varying by direction. These numbers are consistent with what you can see. Normal. The water level matched a crack in the andesite at the eastern margin, a natural fissure shaped like a lowercase h. I recognized it from Dale's description in his August 1976 entry. The waterline sat at the same position on that crack. Dale measured it 47 years ago. The level had not changed, not risen, not fallen, not in 47 years. In a feature with no visible inlet or outlet at 10,600 feet in the Absarokas, through 47 cycles of snowmelt and summer drought and fall freeze, the water level had not moved. Claire walked the perimeter while I logged data. The margin was irregular but continuous rock on all sides, no gravel beaches, no muddy shore, no organic debris, no animal tracks approaching the water, no scat, no feathers, no fur, no insect casings. The rock within approximately 2 feet of the waterline was clean, no lichen, no moss, no mineral deposits. Beyond that 2-foot band, the rock was covered in the normal orange and gray crustose lichen of high-altitude Absaroka exposures. Something was keeping a 2-foot band around the water biologically sterile. At approximately 1100, Claire set up the acoustic test. She placed the Bluetooth speaker at the eastern margin, aimed across the water at the north wall, and opened the tone generator on her phone. A steady 1,000 Hz tone at a measured volume. Clean, reproducible, nothing like a human voice or a rock splash. She hit play and started the stopwatch simultaneously. The tone crossed the water. We waited for the echo. 0.87 seconds. She reset, played the tone again. 0.91 seconds. Again, 0.93. The rangefinder said the north wall was 127 feet away. The echo said the reflecting surface was 500 feet away. Claire aimed the speaker south. Same delay, east to west. Same. In every direction, the acoustic return described a space roughly 500 feet in diameter. We were standing in a space no more than 280 feet across at its widest. The sound did not agree with the light. Claire turned off the speaker. She stood at the margin, holding her phone in both hands. She looked at the north wall, plainly visible, 20-some yards away. A vertical face of dark andesite with a diagonal crack and a patch of orange lichen near the top. Then she said, in a voice I have heard her use exactly once before, when she'd found a beam deflection 3 times the calculated value in a building she had designed. The sound isn't hitting that wall. She said it flat, not scared, factual. The way you state a measurement that you trust your instruments to have gotten right, even though the number makes no physical sense. I want to describe what happened next because it is the thing I did not expect and the thing I believe Dale discovered and could not bring himself to write. We ran the acoustic test again at 13:30. The delay had increased. Claire measured 1.1 seconds. Implied reflecting distance, approximately 615 feet. At 0800, when I had clapped my hands at the margin as a rough initial test while Claire set up equipment, I had counted a delay that felt like half a second, maybe less. The pattern matched Dale's 1978 data. The acoustic space was expanding as the day progressed, not by a trivial amount. Between our 1100 test and our 1330 test 2.5 hours, the implied space had grown from 500 feet to 615 feet. 115 feet of expansion in a cirque that had not physically changed. Claire looked at the data in her notebook. She looked at the photocopy of Dale's entry in her jacket pocket and did not take it out. Then she said quietly, the thing I have not been able to stop hearing. He wasn't measuring the water. He was measuring the space. And the space was getting bigger. It was opening. Opening, that is the word she used. Opening the way a door opens, the way a lung opens, the way something that has an interior expands to admit. I am an earth science teacher. I do not have a framework for a word like that applied to a body of water in a volcanic cirque. But I have the data, and the data says the space that the sound measures is larger than the space that the light shows you, and that the difference grows across the day, and that this has been happening for at least 47 years, and probably since at least 1971, when someone I cannot identify documented the feature 3 years before Dale found it. 3 years before, a careful man walked up a creek drainage and knelt at the edge of something he would spend 2.5 years measuring and the rest of his life not speaking about. We descended from the cirque at 14:30. The temperature dropped back to seasonal normal within 200 feet of elevation loss. The wind resumed its expected speed. The world became the world, andesite and grass and the smell of subalpine fir warming in the afternoon sun and the creek running cold and fast over cobbles that I could name by formation. My knee protested the downhill with a sharp, specific pain at each switchback on the game trail, and I used my trekking poles heavily on the steeper sections while Claire moved ahead with the efficiency of someone whose body is a reliable instrument. I watched her trekking poles catch light in the sun gaps between the Krumholtz, and I thought about Dale descending this same trail in October 1978, his last season, having just touched the surface and felt it warm against his hand, having watched the wind stop and start with his contact, having written the 5 words that he'd left on the last page in a handwriting he never otherwise used. We camped again at the fork. Claire heated water, and we ate in a silence that was not awkward but full, the way silence between people is full when they have both seen the same thing and have not yet found the container for it. The Stellar's jays did not come to the trees that evening. The alpenglow was the same deep orange along the ridgeline. The creek sounded exactly as it had the night before. I sat on the same worn log and looked up the drainage toward the head wall that hid the cirque, and I understood my uncle. The understanding is the part that cost me something. Not fear, not the way people expect when I consider telling this. What it cost me was the comfortable ignorance of thinking I knew who Dale was. I had known him for 31 years. I had sat across from him at Thanksgiving tables. I had watched him weld pipe, quiet and precise, the arc light reflected in his safety glasses. I had visited his grave and thought I was visiting a simple man who had lived a simple life. And the truth is that Dale walked to the edge of something that does not fit the physical world, measured it with instruments he trusted, watched it behave in ways no geology textbook describes, and then came down and lived the rest of his life without telling a single person what the measurements showed. He contained it, the way you contain a fact that has no home in any system you know, not by denying it, not by forgetting it, but by placing it inside yourself and carrying it quietly, year after year, letting it settle into the same silence you built for every other thing you could not share. I cried at that campsite, sitting on the log with my empty meal pouch in one hand, crying the way you cry when you finally understand someone who cannot be told that you understand them because they have been dead for 18 years. Claire put her hand on my shoulder and left it there and did not say a word. We hiked out the next morning. 7 miles back to the trailhead, 4 hours with my knee, the trail unwinding like a sentence I had already read. At the trailhead, we signed the register, and I noticed that the party headed for Sulphur Creek had not signed back in. Their expected return date had been the 7th. It was the 8th. I mentioned it to Claire, and she said she would report it at the ranger station on our way through. I do not know if they were found. That is a detail I should have followed up on and did not, because by the time we reached Cody, I was already reorganizing everything I thought I knew about Dale, and about that drainage, and about the distance between what sound can measure and what eyes can see. I dropped Claire at the airport in Billings 2 days later. She hugged me at the curb in a way she has not since she was a teenager, long, hard, with her forehead pressed against my shoulder. She said, "I'm glad we went." Then she picked up her bag and walked inside without turning around. I drove back to Cody. I went through the fall and winter, managing what I knew the way Dale must have managed it, by not speaking about it, by keeping the data organized, by letting the days accumulate their ordinary weight on top of it. I taught myself to go hours without thinking about the circ, then days. The logs sat on a shelf in my office next to a framed photograph of Dale and my mother taken in 1991. In the photograph, Dale stands beside his welding truck with his arms at his sides, looking directly at the camera. He's not smiling, not frowning, holding his expression the way he held everything, carefully, with no excess. Behind him, above the roofline, the Absarokas are visible. The drainage, where Painter Creek begins, is somewhere up there behind the ridgeline, out of the frame. 3 weeks ago, I received a manila envelope from the Shoshone National Forest Supervisor's office in Cody. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The header read USD Forest Service Region 2, Resource Feature Inventory. The form had fields for location, feature type, dimensions, date of initial documentation, and reporting personnel. Most were blank. 3 were filled in a computer-generated typeface, not handwriting. Location, Painter Creek. Drainage, head, T52NR106. W section 14, approx. 10,600 feet. Feature type, unclassified hydrological. Date of initial documentation, 1971. The same year referenced in the penciled note I found stapled to Dale's requisition form. See 1971 inventory. Someone documented the feature at the head of Painter Creek 3 years before Dale walked up there. His discovery was real. His measurements were accurate. But he was not the first, and the form I was holding had been printed and mailed to me a retired teacher with no connection to the Forest Service, without explanation, without a cover letter, without a return name, from an office that claimed no record of it when I called. The woman in records management said she could not locate a copy of the form in their system, and suggested it may have been mailed in error. She asked for a form number. There was none. She asked for a case reference. There was none. She took my name and number and said she would look into it. 3 weeks. No one has called back. I have called twice. Both times the call was transferred to a voicemail that identifies itself only as resource programs and does not return messages. I filed a second FOYA request specifically referencing the 1971 date, the section and township, and the term unclassified hydrological. The acknowledgement letter arrived in 4 business days, which is faster than any FOIA acknowledgement I have ever received. It contained a sentence I have read many times. Your request has been assigned to an analyst in the regional office and will be processed in accordance with applicable regulations. The analyst's name was not included. A case number was. The case number begins with the prefix RFY, which I have not seen on any other FOIA correspondence and which does not correspond to any prefix listed in the USDA's public FOIA reference guide. I check the satellite imagery for that section of the Absarokas every few weeks. The resolution is not high enough to resolve a 40-yard feature clearly, but I can identify the cirque, the floor, the shadow pattern. In November, 2 months after our visit, the imagery looked normal. The shadow in the cirque consistent with the known depth of the basin, the proportions matching what I saw on the ground. Last Tuesday I checked again. The shadow in the cirque floor was wrong. It was early afternoon and the image timestamp sun high, near its maximum angle for that latitude. The shadow should have been minimal. Instead it was broad, deep, extending beyond the margins of the depression I had stood beside. I used the scale tool to measure it against the cirque wall. The shadow suggested a depression approximately 80 yards across. The water, when I stood at its margin in September, was 40. The feature has doubled. Or the shadow is measuring something the satellite cannot image directly, the same way our speaker measured something the rangefinder could not see. The space behind the water is asserting itself through the data, even when the data is not designed to detect it. That is what I think Dale understood. That is why he stopped speaking. Not because the thing was unspeakable, but because the only language accurate enough to describe it was measurement. And measurement was a conversation he could only have with himself. I have not told Claire about the satellite image. She texted me a link last week to a paper on infrasound propagation in volcanic calderas, with no comment, so I know she is still thinking. I do not know what she is building with the data. She is a structural engineer. She assesses loads and tolerances. She determines what a structure can bear before it fails. I wonder sometimes if she is running that calculation on the cirque, if she is trying to determine the load rating of the boundary between what sound measures and what light shows. And I wonder what it means if the answer is that the boundary is losing capacity, that the space on the other side is pressing outward, that what Dale measured at 650 feet in 1977 and what we measured at 500 to 615 feet in 2023 does not represent a stable condition but a process, expanding, opening, on a cycle longer than a single day. Dale's logs are on the shelf in my office. 9 green cloth-bound books. I keep them next to the photograph. I pick them up sometimes and hold them the way you hold an object that a person you loved held before you, feeling the weight and the texture and the faint impression of use. He carried these in a pack through that drainage for 5 seasons. His hands made the impressions on the cover where the cloth is slightly darker, slightly smoother. He wrote in them by headlamp and by daylight, and by the gray overcast of Absaroka afternoons, sitting on volcanic rock at the edge of a body of water that is not water, measuring a space that is not the space you can see. Nothing that holds that still for 47 years is what it appears to be. The level has not changed. The margin has not shifted. The crack, shaped like a lowercase h, is still the waterline. But the sound goes further every time someone measures it, and the shadow is wider than it was, and somewhere in a filing cabinet or a database or a decommissioned archive, there is a 1971 document that proves someone knew before Dale, and before that person, and possibly before the quad was drawn. The last thing I want to report is something I have not been able to explain and have not tried to. When we were packing up at the cirque, I coiled the measuring tape and stowed the thermometer and put the rangefinder in its case. Claire broke down the speaker and put it in her pack. I took one more look at the water from the eastern margin, kneeling on the andesite, and as I leaned forward, my reflection appeared on the surface for the first time. We had been at the margin for 3 hours. I had knelt there multiple times. The surface had been too still, too flat, too much like something solid for reflections to form the way they do on normal water. But at that moment, with my face perhaps 18 inches from the surface, I saw myself. Clear, detailed, my face and the sky behind me, and the rim of the cirque behind that. And behind my reflection, below it, deeper in, there was a second sky. Not a reflection of the sky above me. A different sky. The light was wrong warmer, more amber, the color Dale would have called opal gray. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then the surface returned to its flat opacity, and my reflection was gone, and the water, if that is what it is, showed nothing but itself. Claire was behind me. I do not know if she saw it. I have not asked. Some measurements you take alone.